when you are subverting the power of government. That's a fundamentally dangerous thing.
You're probably one of two people. Either you believe in some kind of shadow government, or you laugh at those that do. I used to be one of the latter, but I decided I wanted to take the idea of the deep state seriously, and what I uncovered really surprised me.
Patriots who every day come to work saying, how can we defend this country and protect our civil liberties and privacy?
Let's really think about every node of the deep state through a simple lens. Either it's democratic or it's unaccountable, hidden under deep layers, peddling influence, weapons, money, controlling democracy maybe from behind the scenes. And doing so tells us a lot about democracy itself and what we should be doing about it. Because in some way, every historical period and every nation have had some form of deep state. Even in a direct democracy like ancient Athens, legislation put forward for citizens to vote on was decided by the bull behind the scenes, and historians have found that the bull, or council, was dominated by the aristocracy. During the Roman Empire, the Praetorian Guard often became kingmakers behind the scenes too. Emperor Pertinax was assassinated by the Guard after just 2 months in power because he'd attempted to curtail their influence. Behind countless kings' courts, powerful barons, nobles, elites quietly conspired to influence laws, dominate the court, or occasionally overthrow monarchs entirely. Japanese imperial military deep states in Manchuria, or within the army of the Ottoman Empire, global fruit corporations dominating entire banana republics, determining policy and overthrowing democratically elected governments, FBI dossiers intended to blackmail democratically elected officials, British intelligence undermining leftist Prime Minister Harold Wilson, Russian oligarchs, globalist institutions, corporate backroom threats and deals. Actually, everywhere we look in history, a kind of deep state stares back at us, posing a simple question: who is really pulling the strings? I want to lay out something not conspiratorial, but quite simple. If you have layers of democracy at the front, the ballot, legislation, parliamentary debate, executive orders, judicial process, law, a public opinion, polling, and so on, what's going on in the deeper layers? What's accountable, can be accounted for, and what, importantly, is unaccountable? Because, and this is a crucial point, a very influential 2014 study of 1,700 policy decisions found that the average voter preference had a minuscule, almost non-zero, statistically insignificant impact on public policy. That doesn't sound like democracy to me. Does the deep state theory explain why forever wars continue despite opposition? Why banks are bailed out but the economy still fails? Why politicians say they'll do one thing and end up doing another? Why most of us work long hard days while others fly around the world in private jets? Does the deep state matter more than ever? Why is the term so much more resonant now? For anyone who takes politics seriously, it is easy to laugh at these kind of pop culture simplistic political terms like being red-pilled or the deep state, but they're resonant now for a particular reason. And they're useful windows, I've realised, perspectives into reality, perspectives into lots of people's minds too, and often they reveal something important going on underneath the surface. In the US, the resonance has built up over time as trust in government has decreased. Take the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, in which Vietnamese ships fired on the USS Maddox in supposedly international waters. Lyndon B. Johnson used it as an excuse to escalate the Vietnam War, but it later turned out to be more likely a false flag. bad weather on a radar exaggerated, then used as an excuse for the US military-industrial complex to ramp up the war effort. Watergate did little for public trust in an executive office that could have an off-the-books quote-unquote plumbers unit that could wiretap the Democratic opposition. The false reports about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction added more to the distrust, as did Edward Snowden's 2013 whistleblowing that the US state was engaged in mass surveillance of its own citizens. Here's an interesting Monmouth University poll from 2018 that found widespread concern about government surveillance. It said that while few Americans, 13%, are very familiar with the term deep state, another 24% are somewhat familiar, while 63% say they are not familiar with the term. However, when the term is described as a group of unelected government and military officials who secretly manipulate or direct national policy, nearly 3 in 4, that's 74%, say they believe this type of apparatus exists in Washington. But recently, the term has taken another twist, courtesy of Donald Trump. Even before his inauguration back in 2016, Breitbart published a lengthy and influential article entitled "The Deep State versus Donald Trump." Trump has called a whistleblower a quote-unquote deep state operative, Stephen Miller blamed his impeachment on the deep state, and Stephen Bannon has talked about the deconstruction of the administrative state. But the twist is that while they're sometimes talking about the intelligence services or shadowy influence, they're really talking about something much more banal, which we'll get to, government bureaucracy. But we need to go deeper than Trump, because all of this obviously aligns with the idea that since the financial crash of 2008 and the bank bailouts and the increasing inequality, what the people, the demos, want, and what politicians, the elites, do are two clearly very separate things. I'm going to keep referring back to that sentence in this study, that the preferences of average citizens had only a minuscule, near zero, non-significant impact upon public policy back in 2014, because it was that year, 2014, that Mike Lofgren, a retired Republican congressional aide of 28 years, began publishing influential essays and books based on that time period about a very real deep state that he experienced. And his work can be credited with giving the term the deep state more seriousness. Lofgren put it like this: there is the visible United States government, situated in imposing neoclassical buildings around the Mall in Washington, D.C., and there is another, more shadowy and indefinable government that is not explained in Civics 101 or observable to tourists at the White House or the Capitol. The former is the tip of an iceberg that is theoretically controllable via elections. The subsurface part of the iceberg operates on its own compass heading, regardless of who is formally in power. Lofgren sometimes talks in nodes, which I'm going to borrow from here, with Washington at the core, military and industrial contractors around it, Wall Street, which, quote, floods the town with cash and lawyers, Silicon Valley, which provides tech and surveillance, and then bureaucrats and lobbyists, all circling the Capitol, the CIA or FBI with their own contractors and personal networks. I think what's fascinating about Lofgren's analysis is the idea of proximity, all of the nodes jockeying to be as close to power as possible, and how it's a model that can be applied, as we'll see, to any country. Let's start with one of the most obvious nodes of the deep state, the military-industrial complex. It sits around many governments, but Washington in particular, especially in the 20th and early 21st centuries. A combination of the total warfare of World War II, the scope of the Manhattan Project to build the nuclear bomb, the rebuilding of Europe with the Marshall Plan, plus the start of the Cold War, all contributed to never-before-seen networks of factories, scientific research, infrastructure, raw materials, energy, and all of the political and commercial relationships that tied it all together. Much of this type of thing, on a smaller scale, has usually been deconstructed in some way after previous wars, historically speaking, but the scope of the change after World War II led President Eisenhower to warn in his famous 1961 farewell speech that,
"Now this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist."
What Eisenhower saw, and was warning against, were the unwieldy and large incentives for vast numbers of people, politicians, industrialists, generals, scientists, even ordinary workers in offices or munitions factories, say, to keep the wheels of the military-industrial complex turning, to sign new contracts, to build new weapons, to record greater and greater profits, and to push for new wars. In 1961, the US defense budget was already $48 billion. The US had 300 military bases in the US domestically alone and included millions more civilians and workers in companies like Lockheed or Boeing, plus all of the subsidiary companies serving them, providing machinery, say, but also services as boring as food and cleaning and uniforms and transport and so on. Professor of Law Michael Glennon has called it the double government thesis, that in the US, national security is run by what he termed a Trumanite network of career military security and intelligence officials, because they're the ones who have the ability to disclose to politicians the severity of a threat, say, or the necessity of a new military vehicle, creating a vicious cycle. Since Eisenhower's warning, the Cold War, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the decline of the British Empire's policing of the world, particularly by its navy, the shifting of that to America, and the forever wars on terror since 2003 have meant his warning has not only fallen on deaf ears, but has become prophetic. There are now almost 1 million contractors with top secret clearances, and in 2022 the defence sector spent over $100 million lobbying Congress. There are around 600 American military bases in over 40 countries around the world, with US troops in 133 countries, drawing on a defence budget of almost $600 billion. From a deep state perspective, what's notable is the vast number of contracts, local operators, relationships and networks that this entails. Take just one example of a node far away, Camp Lemonia in Djibouti. It has $322 million worth of contracts, including one for a $25 million fitness centre. That's one hell of an expensive gym. So even that has a network of people with different information levels, access levels, incentives, ways of working, relationships with locals and so on. Plus, again, the wider peripheral relationships, likely with thousands of different business contractors, local officials, national government and so on, either locally, more widely, or even flown in internationally. But most contractors want to be as close to Washington as possible. As recently as the 90s, defence contractors like Lockheed, Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics moved their entire headquarters to Washington, which, as Lofgren notes, has grown as the deep state has grown. Lofgren writes, a visitor to the city might be surprised to find ads in the city's metro system selling a fighter plane, or spot the huge sign on a telecom building near the southeast-southwest freeway extolling the virtues of an aerial tanker aircraft. A reader of the National Journal or Congressional Quarterly or Politico will discover full-paid ads for the littoral combat ship. So even the culture of Washington in some way represents a wider deep state. This has created a revolving door between politicians and businesses and military figures. Bloomberg News reported in 2011 that, quote, the top 10 US defence contractors have 30 retired senior officials or former national security officials serving on their boards. Take Army General and NSA Director Keith Alexander. He left government, set up a consulting company called IronNet Cybersecurity, and advises Wall Street lobbying groups, just one contract of which is worth $600,000. Thinking in terms of our democratic accountability versus unaccountable influence, the military-industrial complex adds billions of dollars and millions of people in deep layers, which can be both impossible for elected officials to understand entirely, difficult to control for anyone, and often even operates entirely in secret. Relying on so many contractors adds an extra layer of unaccountability. Take the private security firm Blackwater's infamous stint in the Iraq War. In 2007, they killed 17 Iraqi civilians in what was dubbed the Nisour Square Massacre. Investigators into the firm found, quote, an environment full of liability and negligence. Or take Obama, who is the perfect example of how the military-industrial complex captures the outlook of incoming politicians, especially idealistic ones. Obama went on a journey from hesitancy on escalating in Afghanistan and firm on closing Guantanamo Bay to becoming drone commander-in-chief and keeping the prison open. In his first term, the Pentagon leaked information about the dangers of Obama weakening the US mission in Afghanistan, which turned into a big media story, and Obama soon committed 30,000 extra troops against his initial wishes. CIA Director John Brennan said that Obama, quote, did not have an appreciation of how national security works when he entered office, but that now, quote, he has gone to school and understands the complexities. In other words, the military-industrial complex, despite, as we now know, entirely failing in Afghanistan, took Obama to school. Which school was that exactly? And it can do this by presenting certain information, choosing what it discloses, presenting certain threats as stronger than others, having a strong military take, knowing the field better. They know it. They know all of that better than any incoming democratically elected politician. As the whistleblower Thomas Drake put it, Obama, like any other president, was literally a captive of the people who briefed him on secret intelligence. When you factor in all of those contractors, the number of people working for the US government reaches over 3 million. Each of those individuals make decisions based on their own small networks of information. How much did Congress, for example, know about those 3 million people? How much could anyone possibly know? So there's an interesting overlap in the modern world between information, people, data, knowing about it, and what's come to be referred to as intelligence. Take the CIA. It's relatively small, around 20,000 employees, but the power of the intelligence it can collect is unparalleled. The drive for permanent intelligence services has a long history. In the aftermath of the French Revolution and the upsurge of radical movements threatening to overthrow the system in the 19th century and displace monarchies, authoritarian and right-wing governments developed increasingly sophisticated networks of police and spies to collect information on their own citizens for the first time. Policing is a relatively young phenomenon, historically speaking, too, starting during the 1830s. Fast forward to the wars of the 20th century, as technology improved, governments intensified their efforts in surveillance of enemies both foreign and domestic. Networks of surveillance aircraft and satellites, wiretapping and informants have only gotten more numerous and more sophisticated, and understanding their reach and the effect this has on democracy, because it goes so deep and is so classified, is difficult to quantify. The US government, for example, classifies 50 million documents each year. If this isn't a node of an unaccountable deep state, I don't know what is. If decision making is based on having the right information, and let's remember here that intelligence or intelligence gathering and information are kind of euphemisms and pretty much synonymous, then those with the best information, the best intelligence gathering capacities, those with those cards in their hands can decide what to release or what to withhold, what to twist or present in a subtle, nuanced way that pushes what they want, what their agenda, what they think is best to do. They can decide what to leak and who to leak it to, what conversations to have and when to have them. Do they govern the course of action better than anyone further downstream of that information, of the intelligence gathering capacity? In other words, does this mean that the CIA or the NSA are, logically speaking, decision makers more than any politician, let alone a democratic public? Lofgren writes, there is no more potent sign of the triumph of the deep state than the fact that the contractor personnel are empowered to vet the secrets our elected officials are allowed to see. There's no better proof of how concerning this is than the history of governments the CIA has helped overthrow. Iranian leader Mossadegh was overthrown in 1953 because he nationalised British oil, Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954 because of land reforms affecting the US United Fruit Company. It's happened in Hawaii, Chile, Nicaragua, the list goes on. This is an entirely different video. In the UK, union leaders have been spied on, and France has a history of using intelligence influence on its former colonies in Africa. More recently, and most notably, the extent of surveillance and its increasingly strong links with Silicon Valley was revealed by the whistleblower Edward Snowden in 2013.
Our breaking news this evening is the identity of the man who sent the Obama administration into defend and explain mode this week. His name is Edward Snowden. He's an American former CIA employee and computer technician.
Snowden leaked 160,000 NSA records to journalists, and an analysis found that only 11% of the surveillance was on targeted individuals, with the rest being surveillance of over 10,000 ordinary American citizens, including looking at information about their love and sex lives, their mental health, their politics, their religious views, and their finances. But the documents also revealed big tech complicity in helping the NSA intercept internet traffic. The CIA has paid AT&T, for example, $10 million to provide information on overseas calls, and 70% of the NSA budget is spent on outside contracts, more layers of deep state and fewer layers of democratic control. So let's return briefly to that initial frame. Democratic accountability versus unaccountable actors, influence, layers, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, theoretically speaking, on the one hand, the military and intelligence in most countries are accountable to democratically elected officials or heads of state. But Snowden's revelations, the secret plots to overthrow foreign governments throughout history, the WMD misinformation in Iraq, and the very new scope, reach, technological power of these technologically advanced organizations, their closeness with big tech and Silicon Valley, seriously problematizes the idea that intelligence services are entirely accountable. As Hans Born and Ian Lay remind us in this paper, quote, "It should be underlined that democratic intelligence oversight systems have come into operation only comparatively recently, i.e. mostly since the mid-1970s, and in many states only since the 1990s. This development represents a move away from a guardian state in which important issues are left to the discretion of professionals towards a democratic state in which important issues are subjected to normal democratic decision-making procedures." In other words, both democratic oversight, the mechanisms of democratic oversight of these institutions, and the scope, the size, the scale of the institutions themselves are very new, historically speaking. We should remember that all across the modern era, all government institutions and private ones, including what we'll look at next, bureaucracies, have gotten bigger and bigger and much more complicated. In the 2024 primaries, Trump told supporters that he would shatter the deep state. Ramaswamy said they'd be shutting down the administrative state, and for MAGA and for so many across the West right now, the federal bureaucracy and establishment politics is the swamp of the deep state. I know many of you will already be groaning at me including government bureaucracy in this, but A, I'm trying to be neutral in some sense, but also B, thinking about the relationship between, for example, widespread suspicion that the CIA could kill JFK and the banality of everyday bureaucracy. The tension between those two things reveals something about modernity and about our institutions that is crucial to analysing all of this. That the bigger institutions get, the less individuals feel that they are or can be in control both of those institutions and of their own lives. This is one of the most powerful ironies of modern life. The promise of democracy is about self-determination, about living better lives for all of us, and that the people are accountable for that and accountable to themselves, can run their own lives democratically. But to do that, we've built enormous institutions that dwarf any single individual. So is modernity running away from us? If we're starting again with our framing of democratic accountability versus unaccountable influence and actors, we must look at what is the largest node. The US federal government, for example, employs 3 million people. Add in the 1.3 million serving in the military, and that's around 1.5% of the entire population. The UK employs around 500,000 in its civil service, that's 0.75% of the population, but then add in the NHS and that reaches 8.5%. To take a couple of random examples, India also employs around 1.4%, whereas the Chinese Communist Party employs around 56 million people, which is around 4% of the population, and that's gotta be the biggest, most impenetrable deep state in the world. How are these bureaucracies part of the deep state? Well, millions of people is pretty deep, we have to acknowledge that. And all of those people have, in some sense, varying goals and incentives and values and ideas that it's impossible to always hold to account democratically. If we take Eisenhower's military-industrial complex as the model, where there's a nexus of incentives between politicians and the military and industry, the same kind of nexus applies in some way to every single department, every person in a network, every relationship. A political pharmaceutical complex, an environmental protection complex, the duck hunting stamp federal complex. That is a real government agency, by the way. My point is that any group who cares about what they do have incentives to do the thing better, to grow maybe, to get more resources, to be more effective and to get more power. Trying to curtail government bureaucracy is nothing new. Ever since the New Deal in the 1930s, conservatives like Buchanan and Nixon and Reagan have, in different ways, wanted to fight what they see as a liberal bias in the state apparatus, or dismantle institutions entirely. But MAGA is new. Only with MAGA do we see the hyper-sensationalistic language of the deep state conspiracy world wielded to the banal critique of bureaucracy. Is there any truth to the claim that that bureaucracy is a kind of deep state? The issue with analysing these institutions and the parallel questions is that it's also big. Bureaucracies, as we've seen, are massive and they're varied and they have different jobs and they have different incentives, and any interpretation, any analysis is ideologically loaded, but we can at least poke around the edges. Okay, a quick history here. The key change was the Pendleton Act in 1883. Until then, federal roles, in fact pretty much all roles, were filled by what was called the patronage system. That elected politicians would fill all the government and civil service positions themselves when they were elected. Yes, that's right, all of them. And all of those people would then lose their jobs if they lost the next election, and a new lot of people would come in. Of course, the government was much smaller back then, but as it got bigger, filling every role as a party came into office was becoming quite time-consuming. Patronage was like currency. Offices would be exchanged for support in upcoming elections. You back me and you can run agency X. But with the Industrial Revolution and the growth of modern institutions, factories and products getting more complicated, more globalization, bigger and more advanced militaries and weapons and press departments and tactics and strategies and the vast collaboration required to build or advance modern technology, say innovation, more to manage basically. Civil services everywhere became much more complicated, much more numerous, much more voluminous. Numerous, voluminous. The main issue was the growth of the labour force. Politicians were spending all of their time filling all of those government roles. They were literally spending all of their time doing it. To take one example of the scope of the patronage or spoils system, during President Cleveland's administration at the end of the 19th century, 43,000 postmasters were removed to make room for new Democratic Party postmasters. The post office was one of the most important institutions at the time. In fact, such was the extent of the issue that in 1870 James Garfield remarked that politicians were spending a third of their time managing the patronage system. Ironically, Garfield was then assassinated by someone who was annoyed that he hadn't given him a role. But this wasn't the only reason. Patronage bred corruption, scandals, fraud, and inefficiency. Politicians were incentivized to give out roles, more and more roles, so departments became bloated and too large. The New York Times reported that at no point had the defects of the previous method of appointment, that is patronage, seemed more obvious. The customs service at the Port of New York had been properly considered as the climax of inefficiency and corruption. The end of the patronage system is one of the major and most underappreciated turning points in history. The 1883 Pendleton Act enacted merit hiring for a small number of federal employees. It then expanded across the next century, until in 1980, patronage accounted for less than 1% of the number employed, and similar changes happened in Europe at the same time, like Britain's Northcote Trevelyan Report of 1854, which slowly ended the patronage system and brought in a merit system. But this change was really the beginning of the deep state bureaucracy critique. There are a number of criticisms historically that can be organised loosely into 4 buckets. 1. Efficiency and incentives. 2. Unaccountability. 3. Policy drift. And 4. Departmental expansion. The attempt to tackle inefficiency is nothing new. Take President Carter's attempt to address it back in the 70s. His administration passed the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978, establishing merit pay for middle managers based on their performance. The aim was to provide incentives to innovate and improve their departments, but as a result, supervisors were just incentivized to rate their own departments highly to get more resources. The metrics weren't effective enough to work, and Congress didn't agree to big enough rewards for it to be effective. So ultimately, Carter's reforms failed. As Johnson summarises in this book, quote, most authors have concluded that the 1978 law did little to institute pay performance incentives. Or take another example. One of the best known hypotheses about bureaucratic behaviour is that of William Niskanen in 1971. He argued that bureaucrats are primarily motivated to maximise their agency's budget. The idea is that by expanding their budget, they can increase their influence, their staff, their prestige, what they can do, and their power, ultimately improving the standing or effectiveness of their department, of their positions. This theory has become popular fodder for the right. Jordan Peterson, for instance, has recently referenced this model when discussing the tendency of institutions to grow for their own sake, often becoming bloated and inefficient over time. However, while the theory has intuitive appeal, it hasn't held up well when studied empirically. Johnson reviewed the evidence and found little data to support this idea that bureaucrats would act to expand their budgets as a primary motivation. The behaviour of bureaucrats is complex, and there are a mix of motivations and cultures and norms and politics and constraints and personal values. Obviously, budget maximisation isn't the primary thing people do. And there's little really that bureaucrats or civil service institutions can do to get more money. This is a naked political issue, much debate on the surface, much accountably. It also ignores the fact that this is one of the primary complaints against the patronage system in the 1800s, that politicians were incentivised to give out more and more roles to garner more and more support. Another critique is the slow speed of bureaucracies. In response to David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, complaining that the civil service slows everything down, Jeremy Hayward, a top civil servant in the UK, told a committee that, quote, part of our role is to give advice as to whether something will work, whether something is contrary to the law. Occasionally, that will come across as trying to slow things down or stop things happening. That is part of our job. Or take one more criticism, policy drift. We've looked at the deep state's ability to shape politics subtly through their actions, by choosing what to work on, when to work on it, how to work on it, by withholding or revealing information, by convincing a president that just a quick little coup is in order in that country that no one's really heard of. Policy, on a national or international scale though, is usually hugely complicated and is made in collaboration with lots of people, from politicians to experts to lawyers and bureaucrats and all of the rest. All of them affect in some way the end result. And the design of the policy, because of all of that, can drift a certain way or another over time, depending on how the system works. In other words, the system, by its sheer size and weight and influence, usually pushes and gets in some way what it wants. Since Nixon and Reagan in particular, the right has complained that the system, including the media, has a liberal bias. If you're on the left, the system has a capitalist or money interest bias, and we'll get to that shortly. The right, though, through think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, has tried to counter this liberal bias with a return to patronage and accountability, to use right-wing politicians to force out civil servants and to take a sledgehammer to bureaucratic institutions. Heritage has been very influential in formulating Republican policies, notwithstanding its non-profit, charitable tax status. A document released by the Heritage Foundation advised the following: that the offices of presidential personnel, OPP, must make appointment decisions based on loyalty first and expertise second, and the whole governmental apparatus must be managed from this perspective. Does that sound familiar to what's going on at the moment? Lofgren wrote before what was going on in the moment, but he compared it to the Soviet system, saying that this is the Leninist principle in a nutshell. Power over merit. Okay, so broadly, the literature on bureaucracy is vast and complicated. Maybe the most well known is James Wilson's book called Bureaucracy. In it, he describes how bureaucracies aren't motivated like typical businesses that they are often compared to, and so things like efficiency are not good metrics, or at least not the only metrics. There are often ambiguous, conflicting goals, unknown constraints, and an organisational culture that matters more than simple efficiency. Reform efforts, he argues, should focus on the political and structural constraints and incentives that shape bureaucratic action rather than just blaming bureaucrats for inefficiencies. And it's worth remembering this when people talk about efficiency in governments. In the US, as the Brookings Institute reports in this report, eliminating the entire on-payroll federal workforce would reduce total federal spending by less than 5%. I think what's most interesting from our perspective, the layers of accountability and unaccountability, is that growth of extra layers of deep contractors. John DeLulio at the Brookings Institute wrote that, quote, "The number of people who get paid from the US Treasury but work for private businesses and non-profits is now more than 3 times as large as the entire on-payroll federal civilian workforce." The real deep state isn't inside government, they say, but is, quote, "the contractor state." They argue it consists of 4 intersecting networks. One are megacorporations led by, quote, big defence contractors. Then you have state and local government leaders that try and reduce federal bureaucracy and support contracting out to these private companies. And then the taxpayer subsidised non-profit organisations that have multi-million-dollar annual budgets. And then finally career congresspersons in both the Democratic and Republican parties. We'll return to this at the end, but it's important to note that we think of the public and private sectors as separate, when they're not really. As with every node we've looked at so far, and with the growth of contractors and the sheer size and power of the private sector, there's another node that circles all of the rest. Let's look at the money complex. When taking on monopolies and trusts in the early 19th century, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said, "We must make our choice. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." We've seen how big the state has become, and I've looked at the US a lot because it's the biggest and the most powerful, and it kind of serves as a model. Many are downstream in some ways from it, but this applies to most states across the West. Plus, the growing or the more common influence of the private sector through contracts since the 80s and 90s, but Brandeis is pointing to something much more fundamental: the unaccountable influence of money more broadly, and money on all of this. Around all of the other nodes revolve lobbyists, the revolving doors between the public and the private sectors, and the influence of big cash. Money makes the world go round, so it makes sense to include this node at the edge somewhere, or maybe in between, with money going outwards from things like state contracts and infrastructure investment, social security, and money coming in and through and between, influencing the state and the people within it by lobbying or the promise of high-paying jobs after office or wealthy benefactors, plus the influence of banking and bond and stock markets and the expertise surrounding all of that. All of this is difficult to quantify and can be approached in different ways. Corporate money can finance political parties exerting influence before they even get into government. So not only deep state, but deep parties. There are also strong ties between central banks like the Fed or the Bank of England and the wider banking sector or Wall Street. In short, the influence of money is both direct and indirect and very difficult to quantify. Recently, short-lived UK PM Liz Truss's position was made untenable when the Bank of England essentially told her her policies would bankrupt the country, and Clinton reportedly once said that, "You mean to tell me that the success of the economic programme and my re-election hinges on the Federal Reserve and a bunch of fucking bond traders?" Much of politics revolves around that old adage that ultimately it's the economy, stupid. But is this unaccountable money power influencing more than anything else the outcome of democracy? The obvious answer to that is yes, especially in reference to our initial study about, say it with me now, ordinary voters having only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. But we have to be careful here because it doesn't happen in a simple way. Because political elites have the ultimate power to change policy. They are the ones closest to the levers, but given their proximity to moneyed interests, the interests of the political elite and the money class, the economic elite, have always, almost always at least, aligned in some way. Disagreements between elites are more common than battles, say, between elites and a democratic people. And money does make the world go round, but sometimes ideas like national identity, or imperialism, or colonialism, ideas about race science in the past, sometimes ideas are more powerful than money. So it's difficult to disentangle the two. History provides some big examples of how money influences the deep state straightforwardly. Many of the interventions and coups that America has engaged in over the years, from Panama to Hawaii to Haiti to Nicaragua, have been found to have big money interests encouraging them behind the scenes. In 1933, the famous General Smedley Butler wrote, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in." He continued, "I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In other words, the pursuits of money, profit and business ran through all of it, from the businessmen to the bankers to the state to the army. This is one dimension of the money nexus. Another, more recently, is how banks have usually gotten their way. And in the wake of the 2008 financial crash, Chair of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, put it bluntly, supposedly saying about granting the banks the massive $700 billion bailout, "If we don't do this tomorrow, we won't have an economy on Monday." Bankers and the Fed said that this bailout should be passed immediately with no amendments. Exceptional in history. Lofgren writes that it was barely 3 pages long, and it was the greatest grant of power to the executive that I have ever seen. $700 billion, the largest single-purpose request for money in history up to that time, would be handed to the Treasury with no strings attached to bail out the banks as Paulson saw fit. Paulson's subordinate, Neil Kashkari, was to be the administrator of the money, and he later told an economist friend of mine that the $700 billion figure was a number plucked out of thin air. Democrats have been pushing that the plan should include provisions for keeping those losing their mortgages in their homes, but the banks got what they wanted, no amendments, and despite crashing the global economy, came out mostly stronger, growing their assets from 43% of the US economy to 56% in 2012. The popular narrative has been that the quick-acting bailout was both necessary and saved the economy for ordinary people around the world, especially when compared to the drawn-out depression of the 1930s. But is this really true? The rich have only gotten richer, inequality has grown more and more, economies have been stagnant. Need I go on? The $700 billion TARP programme was unpopular with voters at the time, but supported by almost all bankers. Now, this isn't the place to explore that further, only to say that the bankers here, the money complex, got what they wanted. Bankers, economists, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, central banks more broadly, Wall Street, the FTSE, the bond market, all have a huge impact on policy, not just by them being thought leaders, if you want to put it like that, but also by being technically knowledgeable, having command of scarce and valuable economic data, and of course resources, but also simply by having relationships with all the other important people in our deep state network. A tapestry, if you like, woven through with big money. This happens even more directly through lobbying, and while you can legislate against it in many ways, conversations behind closed doors can never be legislated against. Take the infamous Koch brothers network. In the 70s, business leaders, including the Kochs and Joseph Coors, responded to a memo from the lawyer Lewis Powell Jr., arguing that business needed to step up its pressure, countering the growing cultural and political power of the left. A powerful network of pro-capitalist, anti-state business pressure groups grew from there, with money from chemical, oil and munitions industries funneled into lobbyist and pressure groups like the Heritage Foundation and Cato. Charles Lewis of Public Integrity wrote that the Kochs are on a whole different level. There's no one else who has spent this much money. The sheer dimension of it is what sets them apart. They have a pattern of law-breaking, political manipulation and obfuscation. I've been in Washington since Watergate, and I've never seen anything like it. They are the Standard Oil of our times. So by now, the pretty uncontroversial open secret is that, as Republican Senator Vance McAllister said, money controls Washington. In fact, one of the nodes we could insert between the Washington Capitol Hill buildings and outer nodes like Wall Street are the tax-exempt foundations set up to more efficiently direct the influence of money on those in power. There are more than 1 million in the US alone, about 5% of the economy, and about 1,600 of them with headquarters in the greater Washington area. And they include military contractors that call themselves charitable and get tax-free status despite paying their CEOs millions of dollars. These are literally deep state satellites revolving around the government, funneling money and peddling influence down the channels that matter to steer the direction of state policy. They also provide a revolving door of job opportunities and big payouts for retiring politicians, incentivising them to keep on their good side at best and do as they say at worst. Let's just take a look at a few examples of how the revolving door works. In 2013, Jim DeMint resigned from Congress despite having 4 years left on his term because he said he could exert more influence as the president of the Heritage Foundation than he could as a sitting senator. Not to mention, of course, that he could become much more wealthier while doing it. Or take Robert Rubin of Goldman Sachs. He became Clinton's Treasury Secretary, lobbied to repeal Glass-Steagall, which separated commercial and investment banking, which is seen to be a contributing factor to the 2008 crash, became director of Citigroup, and over $126 million a year, and at the same time, Citigroup was being bailed out by the taxpayer. Or take Clinton himself. He earned around $105 million from the business world since he left office. That's quite a big incentive for future politicians not to annoy business interests while they're in office. We could go on. The point is that not much of this, of course, is democracy in practice or democratically accountable, and billions are spent by just a handful of donors on elections in America each year, while 72% of Americans support imposing more limits on this happening. Does that happen though? Democracy indeed. In 2013, Jeff Bezos purchased the Washington Post for $250 million, promising to respect its editorial independence. Bezos joined a long line of businessmen who have ventured into publishing, from Lord Northcliffe in Britain to Berlusconi in Italy and Jay Gould and William Randolph Hearst in the US in the 19th century, whose own father, by the way, was a mining tycoon and a senator. Great example of the complex in action. This year, though, Bezos released a statement that said, "I'm writing to let you know about a change coming to our opinion pages. We are going to be writing every day in support and defence of two pillars, personal liberties and free markets." Bezos owns Blue Origin, and along with Elon Musk, who of course also owns his own media platform X, both have billions of dollars in government defence contracts. Ultimately then, this deep state tapestry has another node, the cultural node, the media node, the PR node, that also sits somewhere around the periphery and running through, both influencing and being influenced. Media nodes are in some ways the most important nodes, as they're the only ones through which we can get any insight into how the deep state functions at all. There's no simple model that says that the media is all top-down propaganda, say, or all bottom-up and entirely independent. The reality is, of course, much more complex and varies across the board. Sometimes a story might have been pushed by a senator and a military contractor to further a specific idea that they have. Other times the media publishes a story entirely independent of any sources within all of that deep state stuff we've looked at. And other stories might sit somewhere in between. Some might come from a begrudged civil servant or a Silicon Valley whistleblower. Some stories are shaped by the releasing of material out of our deep state, others by the withholding of certain details, and so it's shaped in that way. Or the selective presentation of intelligence from a police investigation, or the CIA or the NSA, or the conversation that MI5 and someone at the CIA has had. We have no way of telling, but all of that shapes how stories are constructed in some way. What's most fascinating, and a subject of continual analysis, is how this entire network shapes ideas. Take this comment from Obama. "Increasingly, I found myself spending time with people of means, law firm partners and investment bankers, hedge fund managers and venture capitalists. I found myself avoiding certain topics during conversations with them, papering over possible differences, anticipating their expectations." And in a way then, because we really have no consistent idea of which stories have been shaped and which are entirely bias-free and which are rational and which are based on properly sourced evidence and which aren't, the deep state exists in all of us, in here. And take this comment Elizabeth Warren made about Larry Summers in 2006. She said that he told her, "I could be an insider or I could be an outsider. Outsiders can say whatever they want, but people on the inside don't listen to them. Insiders, however, get lots of access and a chance to push their ideas. People, powerful people, listen to what they have to say, but insiders also understand one unbreakable rule. They don't criticise other insiders." This is a great distillation of how the deep state functions. Either you get invited to all the dinner parties, get the latest information and gossip, be in the club, stay ahead of the game, get the funding, the contacts, the privileges, or you can say whatever you like outside, on your own, in the cold. In many ways then, the elite networks that undergird the deep state are transmitted loosely in two ways. Through the cultures of institutions and how that's passed on no matter who the members are, one senator passing on the rules of how to do things to the next, one set of cultural ideas about etiquette passed on from president to president, the staff at the White House, how the White House functions, its routines, its staff, its practices, its deeper culture, and then also through elite universities that many of these people pass through. In Britain, for example, since 1900, 71% of prime ministers have attended Oxford or Cambridge, with many learning how to think, quote unquote, through the infamous Oxford PPE course. And by the way, that only includes the correct sort of philosophy, politics and economics. Similarly, in France, the énarques are the elite figures that are educated at the Grande École, the great schools, and then go on to serve in elite positions in the military, banking, or politics, or as civil servants. They all join the same student clubs, the families know one another, and they can ring a newspaper editor or an investment banker over lunch. Or if they can't, Daddy can. What we've seen is that the deep state functions as a kind of nexus, a meeting of relationships across different sectors, like an apex, with elites navigating and building coalitions within that network structured by it. So the nexus both structures ideas by having to convince or toe the line or stay on the good side of peers or get that promotion, plus it has some gaps in between, some points of contention, some wiggle room. Someone like Noam Chomsky would argue that the deep state extends to the media, who manufacture consent by filtering out information that's against the establishment's interests. Groupthink, establishment dinner parties, the revolving door, the profit motive, they all filter selectively what's presented to the public. Editors in the media are picked, Chomsky wrote, by the, quote, selection of right-thinking personnel and by the editors and working journalists' internalisation of priorities and definitions of newsworthiness that conform to the institution's policy. Ultimately, the filters narrow the range of news that passes through the gates and even more sharply limit what can become, quote-unquote, big news. The powerful subtly manage to filter the news environment, emphasising some things and conveniently forgetting or de-emphasising others. And most notably for us, for this analysis, one of the filters Chomsky and Edward Herman, his co-author, point to in Manufacturing Consent is PR. They write that the media are dependent on a finite number of sources that are embedded in institutions like the White House or police departments or trade groups or embassies. The Pentagon, for example, spends billions on PR, and the US Chamber of Commerce, a pro-business lobby, spends around $200 million a year. So that's yet another node we could add, the network of public relations firms, spin doctors, branding and marketing experts that have built up slowly over the past century, all of which is very costly, driven by profit, and have become firmly situated within party and government machinery. Chomsky wrote that the press office is now the focus of the whole congressional operation in order to pump out a smokescreen of misleading propaganda claiming that Congressman X really cares about you. Now, looking into this, many scholars today do criticise Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model as being too kind of monolithic, ignoring the goodwill or hard work or fractures or points of freedom and disagreement within and between actors in the media establishment. I kind of like it as a model, if you acknowledge too that it's a very simple one. It's an expression of what Gore Vidal famously quipped when he said, "It's not a conspiracy, it's that they all think alike." But is this fair? How can these millions of people we've looked at, all these different nodes, think in exactly the same way? Is that too simplistic? Or do we need to think about fracture, dissent, disagreement, friction between all these different nodes? How does that work? In fact, thinking carefully about how and where and why disagreement and dissent and change happens within this monolith that we've painted is a perfect way to finish analysing how it all works. Because first, we need a bit of optimism. Second, change always happens, and looking at those points of contention helps us understand how, why and when that change happens. And also all of this can help us to all think about how we can improve and counter it more broadly. Okay, at this point, from what we've constructed, the deep state is obviously varied enough to invalidate in some way the idea that it's a single monolithic conspiracy directed from anywhere, simply at the bottom by some shadowy elites, or from the top like a figure pulling the strings. At the same time, all of these nodes tend to settle around a group identity, that is hegemonic. The nodes shift like a kaleidoscope. There are disagreements between and within them, so maybe we should talk about deep states rather than a deep state, vying for power. Let's look at some of the big issues that have kept coming up and think about some possible solutions. The first and most obvious thing to say about our accountable versus unaccountable lens is get money out of politics. This is a given, but it's both easy in some areas and difficult in others, and really should be the subject of an entirely different video. I can't cover everything here, but if we're talking about unaccountable influence over democracy, big money and lobbying is obviously number one. The second thing though, if we're talking about accountability within all this, is transparency. During and after the pandemic, the UK Health Minister, Matt Hancock, came under fire when it was discovered that a £40 million government contract for COVID tests had been awarded to Hancock's local pub landlord. Hancock is known as a somewhat tragicomic figure here in the UK. The even more comical fact that a pub landlord was given a multi-million-pound contract for delivering medical devices he had no experience of delivering over a pint of beer points to something often underappreciated about the deep state: its banality. The philosopher Hannah Arendt famously talked about the banality of evil. What comes up again and again for us is the banality of conspiracy, the banality of the deep state. One study found that a third of contracts awarded by the Conservative government during the pandemic had red flags. The banality of it is there is no real conspiracy, there are rich people doing deals with their rich friends. Oversight and transparency then is key. Harvard's Stephen Walt has remarked that there is no deep state, but that instead it's hiding in plain sight. Think tanks, lobby groups, civil institutions, and so on. But I think hiding in plain sight is an exaggeration. For every deal like Hancock's that gets reported on that we know about, there are thousands behind closed doors, behind the corridors of power that we never even hear about. What's reported, disclosed, made public is inevitably decided in some way by elites. There are many examples we could point to for improving oversight and transparency. Take just one, South Korea. Corruption was improved by implementing an online portal to see permits, applications, complaints, with the idea of transparency at its core. And afterwards, a survey found that up to 70% of citizens believed corruption decreased after it was implemented. There are many other things we can talk about: Freedom of Information Act, making data and information publicly available easily by request online, thinking about when something is or isn't classified, government databases being open to the public, making the revolving door between government and the private sector more difficult, and, and this is really important, making sure whistleblowers are legally protected. We should be encouraging whistleblowing, not making it more difficult. In fact, if we could add anti-nodes amongst our nodes, whistleblowers would be one of the main ones. Next, we should always be thinking about how to improve these systems. I'm not a fan of what Musk is doing and how they're going about it and what their intentions are. But people on the left often ironically criticise Musk stripping back government, but are often the same people who have criticised US aid for decades for being a vehicle for the promotion of US imperialism. This, by the way, is a good conversation on that. Obviously, any discussion about improving the state will be ideologically loaded. The left and the right will want to do different things, and the right often uses efficiency as a front for just deconstructing those institutions entirely. But I think liberals and people on the left often have not been particularly good at thinking about ways we should be improving institutions, especially as technology has gotten better and the world moves faster. Just take a listen to this list of drives to change how government works over the years from this Ronald Johnson book on federal government and the problem of bureaucracy. 1905, Roosevelt's appointment of the Keep Committee to organise the federal government more effectively. Taft, 1912, Commission on Economy and Efficiency. Roosevelt, Brownlow Committee, 1936. Truman, 1949. Hoover Commission, 1953. Under Eisenhower, President Carter's Reorganisation Project, 1977. Reagan's Private Sector Survey on Cost Control, 1982. Most recently, President Clinton's National Performance Review. And if you look to the UK, you have people like Lord Rothermere using the Daily Mirror to publicise his Anti-Waste League, which sought to mobilise opinion against excessive government spending. If you look to 1921, Lloyd George, the Geddes Committee to find cost-cutting measures. My point here is that Doge is as old as the hills. So how can we make sense of this? Let's look at the evidence. There are a few themes that keep coming up. What we really want in all of this, quite obviously, is decent, smart, innovative, hard-working people who are accountable ultimately to the electorate. Ideology aside, we need mechanisms for selecting talented people. But what do talented people do? Are they efficient, productive, accountable, innovative, upstanding? Ronald Johnson says that performance is a problem because of the unusual protections civil servants have from firing and rehiring, plus the rigid pay structure. Seniority is privileged over merit. Johnson concludes that the fear of a return to patronage as evil presents, quote, an obstacle to meaningful reform, that we shouldn't worry about a return to the patronage system, but we might have gone too far the other way, making it a static, immovable bureaucracy. He writes, it became increasingly difficult for federal politicians to motivate or to manage the bureaucracy. As tenure provisions were strengthened and bureaucratic rules extended, the ability for politicians to dismiss employees was reduced, weakening their control over the bureaucracy. He continued that the fear of patronage is a convenient ploy that employee unions and politicians can use to discourage returning to anything that whiffs of old patronage. For example, in 1978, a union criticised a bill by saying that it allows for the ready politicisation of the civil service. Now, obviously this is a concern, but just swap politicisation in that last sentence for democratisation. Words that should be, I'm not saying they always are, but they should be in some way interchangeable. Obviously, we want a democratic civil service. And that requires, in some sense, the politicisation of the civil service. If you swap politicisation for democratisation, you can see that there are two very different ways of looking at this. The challenge is a difficult one though, as one of the benefits of a protected civil service is that employees can work in a neutral way across administrations on projects that take a long time or require some stability. It's a strange paradox though, because as soon as this happens, it has the potential to become unaccountable and non-democratic. In some ways then, effective administration requires a deep state that functions pragmatically and is somewhat immune to the back and forth of democracy. The question is always how much democracy and when. When should we be doing stuff? When should stuff be open to voting? And when should it be left for a certain amount of time? And the most obvious place this happens is the period between elections, 5 years, 8 years, whatever it is. This might sound stupid after everything I've just said, but there would be such a thing as too much accountability. For example, no one wants a public meeting in the village square every single day for 8 hours. There are no easy answers here. In his review of the literature, Johnson says, quote, that there is no consensus on the role that bureaucrats play in policy formation and implementation, plus that no satisfactory explanations for the persistence of the problems of bureaucracy have been offered. But the suggestion is that more patronage and more accountability might be a good thing. This is a theme that comes up often and is key to understanding the deep state. Who is ultimately accountable? It's why whistleblower protection is really integral. It forces accountability between the gaps of the nodes when things go wrong. It's why transparency is key. Journalists, citizens, employees all become more accountable for having a look and keeping an eye on what's going on. Or take this book. The author Dan Davis argues that big institutions, and he's talking about corporations as much as states, have incentives to build in what he calls accountability sinks, where accountability is kicked down the road to the next person and the next and the next to avoid taking responsibility for something. Everyone knows that frustration of not knowing who's accountable for something that you're trying to get solved, of being left on hold on the phone or being told, "I'm sorry sir, there's nothing I can do about this." And I do think tech can help governments obviously modernise by bringing people closer to those that govern them. For example, reading this book, Recoding America by Jennifer Palker, and also in the UK talking to anyone who knows anything about the systems the NHS, the National Health Service, relies on, will make you think twice about just simply outright criticising anyone who says that government needs to operate more efficiently. Governments are usually antiquated and slow and outdated and stuck in the past. And in the modern world, as technology gets better, the institutions obviously need radically reforming. That is, except Estonia. They've entirely digitised the state, apparently saving over 3,000 years of civil servant hours. You can do everything online. Pay your taxes or incorporate a company in minutes. They have e-IDs and decentralised blockchains to ensure security and transparency. You can vote, get your bus pass, driving licence, medical records, prescriptions, all online. X-Road is a decentralised platform that both public and private sectors can plug into. The Estonian government claims it has added 2% to GDP, and since the 90s, Estonia has seen impressive growth rates. The state and its parallel institutions have grown with the demands of modern life. Big institutions are, in many, many ways, unavoidably necessary, but they can always, and always should be, the subject for radical revision and innovation, and in some cases replaced entirely, or at least new institutions built up with the demands of history, because history moves. I think broadly speaking, the kinds of protections against the things we've looked at happen between the gaps of the nodes. The main theme here is transparency, and with the internet, radical transparency is a fascinating idea. There are lots of policies that are probably quite easy to implement, but if we had the political will, open contracting procedures made public online, an easier process for freedom of information laws, again online, streamlined online databases, a more radical connection to the people that are meant to serve and work for us as citizens within the bureaucracy, within the deep state. Demands for accountability backed up by law and public databases online, legal protections for whistleblowers, and, of course, more independent media. Patreon-supported YouTube media maybe, with different incentives, not close to the state, and again, and again, and again, money out of politics. So a deep state might be inevitable. It might be part of the unwieldy, massive, complex machine of modernity, but we can at least bring it out of the murky, deep state waters and into much clearer ones. Alright everyone, thank you so much as usual for watching, and I really appreciate that you've gotten this far. Just watching the video really helps with the algorithm, and a massive thank you as always to all these wonderful people on screen now who support Then and Now. As I've already mentioned, it's the only way to keep doing this without sponsorship. These long form, in-depth videos that take so much time for us to research, put together, edit, all the rest of it. So I am hugely appreciative, and we're trying to make the Patreon membership more and more valuable to you over time by adding courses. There's already a 2-hour course up on thinking differently about history, that goes in depth on some of the stuff that undergraduate and postgraduate history students read about the craft of history, like thinking about history. And I think it's put together really well. People seem to enjoy it. You can join and have a look yourself. You can cancel at any time. The course membership level is $2.99, I think, but you can join for $1 and watch ad-free and early, join the discussion and the rest of it, and support videos like this. If not, please do just press subscribe, press that bell, like, comment, share, follow on social media. All that stuff helps so much. Now I'm going to go back to working on the next video. Thank you. See you next time.